You know, a long, long time ago. So long ago that your great-great-great-great-grandparents hadn't even been born yet. Somebody looked out across a green and hilly land, and they said, "I am going to build a castle." And isn't that a funny thought, really? Just deciding to build a castle, not a shed. Not a little cottage with a garden. A castle. With towers and walls and big heavy gates and all of it. Someone just woke up one morning and decided that was the thing to do. That was around 1,000 years ago, back in a time we call the Middle Ages. And the castles they built back then, some of them are still standing today, right now, tonight, while you're tucked up warm and safe. Old stone walls, a little crumbly in places, covered in moss, with owls living in the towers. Still there after all that time. Let's find out how they made them. First things first, before a single stone was lifted, before a single hole was dug, someone had to decide where the castle was going to go. This was very important. The people who built castles weren't building them just because they liked the look of a castle. They were building them because they wanted to be safe, and they wanted everyone around them to know that someone powerful lived there. A castle was a bit like saying, very quietly but very firmly, "This place is mine." So you wanted to put your castle somewhere that made sense. Somewhere that could see things coming from a long way off. The best place, if you could manage it, was on a hill. A nice high hill where you could stand on the walls and look out for miles and miles in every direction. You could see the fields and the rivers and the little winding roads. You could see if anyone was coming long before they arrived. Can you imagine that? Standing up on a high stone wall early in the morning and watching the mist drift over the fields far below, and knowing that your castle was up above all of it, looking out over everything like a sleepy giant? Some castles were built next to rivers too. Rivers were useful, not just for drinking water, but because a deep river on one side of your castle was like having a wall you didn't have to build. The water did the work for you. And some castles were built right on the edge of cliffs, where the rock dropped straight down to the sea. Those ones must have been extraordinary to look at. The waves crashing far below, the seagulls calling, and this enormous great castle perched right on top of the cliff, like it had always been there. But wherever the castle was going, someone had to choose the spot carefully. They walked around. They looked at the land. They thought about where the sun rose and where the wind blew from. They looked at the ground and wondered what was underneath it. Because you can't build something as heavy as a castle on soft, boggy ground. It would just slowly, gently sink, and that would be no good at all. Once they had chosen the spot, the real work began, and the real work was enormous. The first thing you needed was stone. Great quantities of stone. More stone than you could probably imagine right now, even if you tried very hard. Because a castle wall wasn't like a thin little garden wall. A castle wall might be 3 meters thick. Some were even thicker than that. You could walk along the top of a castle wall, and it would feel almost like walking along a wide path. So where did all the stone come from? It was cut out of the ground, from quarries, big open pits, or cliff faces where workers would hammer and chisel away at the rock until great blocks broke free. This was slow, hard, tiring work. The hammers were heavy. The chisels were sharp. The stone was stubborn. A good worker might cut 1 large block in a whole day of working, maybe 2 if things went well. And then the stone had to be moved. There were no trucks or lorries in those days, of course. No cranes with engines, no diggers. Everything was done with hands and animals and ropes and wooden frames. They used horses and oxen. Those are big, strong cattle, to pull carts loaded with stone. The carts were heavy, and the roads were muddy, and this was slow work. Sometimes the quarry was just next to where the castle was being built, which was a wonderful bit of luck. And sometimes the quarry was miles away, which meant all those cartloads of stone had to travel a long and bumpy journey before they arrived. Isn't it lovely to think about? That sleepy, plodding journey? The great heavy oxen walking slowly along a muddy track, breath clouding in the cold morning air, pulling their load of stone, step by step by step. Now, the people who actually cut the stone into the right shapes and sizes. They were called masons. Stone masons. And they were very, very skilled. Being a stonemason was a proper craft. It took years to learn. Young boys would start as apprentices when they were quite small, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and they would spend years watching and learning before anyone let them near an important piece of stone with a chisel. The masons could look at a rough block of stone and know exactly how to cut it so that it fitted perfectly into the wall. They had special tools, hammers and chisels of different sizes, and something called a square, which helped them make sure the corners were exactly right. They had a good eye for it, the way some people have a good eye for drawing or cooking. Each mason had their own little mark, a shape they would chisel secretly into each stone they finished. Like a signature. Nobody would see it once. The stone was built into the wall. But it was there, hidden away. Some of those little marks are still there today in old castle walls, if you know where to look. A little diamond. A little cross. A tiny arrow. Hidden messages from 1,000 years ago. While the stonemasons were cutting their blocks, other workers were busy digging. The foundations of a castle had to go deep into the ground. Very deep. Because all that stone above was going to be extraordinarily heavy, and you needed the bottom of the walls to be sitting on something firm and solid. So hundreds of workers dug. They used picks and shovels, iron ones, which were better than nothing but still not easy to use in hard ground. They dug down until they hit solid rock, or at least firm, packed earth that wouldn't move. And sometimes that was quite shallow, and sometimes they had to dig a very long way down indeed before they found ground solid enough to build on. The digging men would have been very strong. Strong arms, strong backs, calloused hands. And they would have been very tired by the end of each day. You can imagine them tramping home in the evening, quiet with tiredness, boots caked in mud, ready for their supper and their sleep. When the foundations were dug, they filled them with rubble and mortar, a sort of paste made from lime and sand and water, which dried hard like a kind of natural glue. And on top of that firm base, the walls would begin to rise. The mortar was very important. Without it, you'd just have a pile of stones. With it, you had a wall. Making mortar was its own whole job. You needed lime, which came from limestone, a soft pale rock that you burned in a big fire until it crumbled into a powder. Then you mixed that powder with sand and water, and you got this gray, sticky paste that you could spread between the stones. As it dried, it hardened, and it held everything together. The people who made the mortar and mixed it and carried it to the masons worked very hard too. They mixed it in big wooden troughs, stirring and stirring with long paddles. It was a bit like making a very large, very gray, very heavy cake. And then they carried it up to wherever the masons needed it, often in buckets on their shoulders, climbing up the wooden scaffolding. Scaffolding. That's another thing that's easy to forget about. All the scaffolding. As the walls grew taller, the workers needed a way to get up there and keep building. So they built wooden platforms on the outside and inside of the walls as they went. These platforms were held up by wooden poles and beams slotted into holes left in the stone or tied together with rope. And as the wall got higher, the scaffolding got higher too. Can you imagine that? A whole castle going up slowly, surrounded by a forest of wooden poles and planks, workers climbing and carrying and chiseling away, all this wooden skeleton growing alongside the stone. Skeleton inside it? When the castle was finished, the scaffolding all came down, and the little holes where the poles had been slotted into the wall. You can still see those in old castles today. Little square holes in the stone, rows of them going up the wall. They're called putlog holes. And every one of them is a little memory of a wooden plank that once held someone up while they worked. Now, a castle wasn't just walls. There was so much more to it than that. The most important part of a very early castle was often a tall tower called a keep. This was the heart of the castle, the most protected, most solid, most important building inside the walls. If something went badly wrong, everyone could retreat to the keep, and it would be the last thing standing. Keeps were built to be very, very difficult to get into if you didn't want people getting in. The walls of a keep were thicker than normal walls. The windows were tiny, more like narrow slots than proper windows. Because a big window is a weak point in a stone wall, and also because arrows could come through big windows, which was not ideal. The door of the keep was often not at ground level at all. It was up a floor. So you had to climb a set of stone steps outside, or a wooden ladder, just to get to the door. And in an emergency, you could pull the ladder up behind you, and then the door was even harder to reach. Isn't that clever? Putting the door up high so that nobody could just walk in. It must have made things a little awkward for everyday life. Imagine carrying your shopping up a ladder every day. But it made the castle much safer. Inside the keep, the floors were made of wood, heavy oak beams and thick planks. There would be a great hall on one floor where people ate and sometimes slept. There might be a solar on a higher floor. That was a private room, a little quieter, where the lord of the castle could retreat from all the noise. And right at the bottom of the keep, or sometimes dug down into the ground beneath it, was the Undercroft. A dark, cool, stone-vaulted room where food and supplies were kept. Barrels of salted meat and fish. Sacks of grain, jars of oil. Everything you might need if the castle was besieged, if unfriendly people surrounded it and tried to wait you out. Of course, round the keep, there were the outer walls, the big circuit of walls that enclosed the whole castle and everything inside it. These walls had towers built into them at regular intervals. And this was done on purpose, very carefully. If your wall was just a long, straight line and someone was climbing up it, the people inside couldn't easily shoot arrows at them because the wall was in the way. But if you had towers sticking out from the wall, you could stand in the tower and look along the wall from the side and see anyone trying to climb. The towers were round in many later castles. This was because a round tower was stronger than a square one. If a heavy rock hit the corner of a square tower, the corner could crack and crumble. A round tower had no corners. The force of any blow just slid around it, and the tower stood firm. These little details, the shape of a tower, the height of a wall, the thickness of a gate, were all worked out over many, many years of building and learning. Each generation of castle builders learned from the ones before them. They noticed what worked and what didn't, what stood up and what fell down, and they got better and better at it. The gatehouse was another remarkable piece of building. This was the main way in and out of the castle, and so it had to be the strongest, most defended part of the whole outer wall. The gateway itself was a big arched opening in the wall, wide enough for a horse and cart to pass through. Above the entrance was the gatehouse tower, or often two towers, one on each side of the gate. And inside the gatehouse passage, there were all kinds of clever things to make it very difficult to attack. There was the portcullis. This was an enormous heavy gate made of iron and wood, like a great grid, that could be dropped straight down to block the entrance completely. It ran in slots in the stone walls on either side, and it was raised and lowered by chains connected to a big wooden wheel or winch in the room above. When everyone was safely inside and the portcullis was dropped, nothing was getting through that gate. Nothing. And above the passage, there were holes in the ceiling. Murder holes, they were called, which is rather dramatic. Through these holes, the defenders could pour things down onto anyone inside the passage. Water to put out fires, or other things less pleasant that we won't think about just before bedtime. There was often a drawbridge, too, over the ditch or moat in front of the gate. This was a section of the bridge that could be pulled up, pivoting on huge chains, so that the gateway was completely cut off from the approach road. When the drawbridge was up, the deep ditch yawned in front of the gate, and nobody was crossing it without a very long ladder and a great deal of difficulty. Can you imagine seeing that drawbridge going up for the first time? Hearing the creak of the chains and watching this enormous wooden platform slowly rising, and knowing that the castle was sealing itself shut for the night? Inside the castle walls, the courtyard, sometimes called the bailey, was a busy place. It was almost like a little village on its own. There would be a great hall where everyone ate together, and a kitchen nearby with big stone ovens and open fireplaces where the cooks worked from early morning until late at night. There would be stables for the horses, and castles had quite a lot of horses, which meant there was quite a lot of mucking out to do, which was a job for the younger servants. There would be a well or a water cistern, somewhere to store fresh water. Because if the castle was ever besieged and cut off, you needed water. Without it, you couldn't last long at all, no matter how thick your walls were. There would be a chapel, almost always. A small stone building where the people of the castle could say their prayers. The chapels in castles were often very beautiful inside, even if they were small. The stone arches were carved carefully. There might be a little painted window, colored glass that made the light inside glow amber and blue. And there would be a great many other buildings. A blacksmith's workshop where the ironwork was made and repaired. A bakehouse, a brew house where ale was made. Storerooms and workshops and sleeping quarters for all the servants and soldiers. A castle was never empty and quiet. It was always full of people and animals and noise. The whole process of building a castle took a very long time. A small castle might take 5 or 6 years. A bigger castle might take 10 or 20 years, or even more. There are records of some castles that took 30 or 40 years to finish. And sometimes the person who ordered the castle built didn't live to see it completed. Their children inherited it while it was still half built. And all the while, hundreds of workers were employed. On a big castle building site, there might be hundreds of stonemasons, plus carpenters, blacksmiths, plasterers, tilers, plumbers. Yes, there were plumbers in medieval times. They worked with lead pipes to bring water into the castle, carters to bring in the stone and timber, laborers to dig and carry and mix mortar, and a whole team of people just to keep track of everything. And running a castle building site was like running a very complicated, very muddy, very heavy project. Someone had to order all the materials, make sure the workers were paid, check that the stone from the quarry was arriving on time, decide what needed to happen next. That person was called the master builder, or sometimes the master of works. He was usually someone who had spent his whole life learning about building, watching, doing, making mistakes, learning better. He didn't have drawings the way architects have today, or if he did, they were much simpler. A lot of the decisions were made by the master builder just standing there, looking at what was being built, and knowing from long experience what needed to happen next. Imagine having so much knowledge in your head that you could just look at a half-built wall and know exactly what to do. That takes years and years of learning. And the best master builders were very famous in their time. Lords and kings would compete to hire them. One of the most remarkable things about castle building was how much of it was worked out without any modern science. the masons didn't have calculators. They didn't have engineering textbooks. They had geometry. Simple shapes and ratios that they had learned by heart, passed down from teacher to apprentice for generations. They knew that if you wanted an arch to be strong, you had to get the curve exactly right. Too flat, and the stones would push outward and the arch would collapse. Too steep, and it would be fine for a doorway, but not strong enough for a vaulted ceiling. They knew the proportions that worked. They could draw them out with a piece of string and a stick in the dust, and from that simple drawing, they could cut stones that would sit together perfectly and hold each other up. An arch is a wonderful thing, actually. When you put the stones of an arch together, none of them are just sitting on top of each other. They're all leaning against each other, pressing inward. And that pressing is what makes the arch strong. The last stone you put in, right at the top of the arch, that's called the keystone. It holds all the others in place. You couldn't even put the keystone in until all the other stones were held up by a wooden frame, waiting. And then you'd knock out the wooden frame, and if you'd done it right, the arch would hold itself up perfectly. The stones would all press against each other, and nobody would move. Isn't that just a little bit magical? A bunch of heavy stones holding each other up just because of the shape they were cut into. Castles needed water, and getting water into a castle on top of a hill was a challenge. Many castles had wells dug down through the rock, sometimes a very, very long way down until they hit the water table far below. Digging a well through solid rock was another enormous task. It might take years, and teams of specialist well diggers worked at it slowly and carefully, going deeper and deeper into the earth. Some castles had lead pipes that brought water from a spring higher up on the hillside, running downhill to the castle. Lead was easy to shape into pipes, and the Romans, who had built things 1,000 years before the Normans came along, had figured out how to do this, and the knowledge was passed down. There were also cisterns, big stone tanks where rainwater collected. The roofs of the buildings inside the castle were shaped so that rainwater ran into gutters and down pipes into the cistern. Nothing was wasted. And the fireplaces? There were a lot of those. Every main room in a castle had a fireplace because stone is cold. Stone holds the chill of winter and breathes it back at you all year round. You needed fires going almost all the time in the cold months, and even in summer, a big stone room could feel cool and damp without a fire. The carpenters cut and seasoned the wood. That means drying it out slowly so it doesn't crack when it's used. They made the roof timbers, the floors, the doors, the window shutters. There was no glass in most of the windows in early castles, just wooden shutters you could close against the wind. The light inside was dim, flickering candlelight and firelight, and the shadows moved on the stone walls. Slowly, slowly, over the years, the castle grew. The foundations settled. The walls rose, course by course, one layer of stone at a time. The towers climbed up past the roofline of the great hall. The gatehouse took shape, its two towers framing the dark archway of the gate. The keep stood tall on its mound, looking out over the countryside. And all around it, the scaffold came down as each part was finished, and there was the stone, gray and pale and solid, just as it would look 1,000 years later. Inside, the plasterers came in behind the masons and covered the walls with a smooth white plaster, which was sometimes painted. Not dark and gloomy. No, the inside of a medieval castle was often brightly painted, red and gold and blue, patterns of diamonds and flowers and animals. The great hall might have pictures painted all along one wall, telling a story. It was quite cheerful, actually, in its own medieval way. The tiles were laid on the floors, sometimes plain stone, but in the better rooms, glazed ceramic tiles in patterns of red and cream and black. The craftsmen who made these tiles pressed patterns into the clay before it was fired. Leaves and lions and crosses and geometric shapes. And when they were laid out in a great hall, they made a floor you could look at for hours. The carpenters fitted the doors with iron hinges. The blacksmith had made those, hammering the hot metal into shape on his anvil, sparks flying. The doors themselves were thick oak, heavy and solid, held together with iron studs. And gradually, over the years, the castle became not just a building, but a home. The lord of the castle and his family lived inside, of course. The great hall was where they ate, everyone together, sitting at long tables, with the lord and his family on a raised platform at one end, and the servants and soldiers filling the tables below. There would be music sometimes, and stories told by travelers who had passed through. At night, the great hall might be where many of the household slept too, rolled up in blankets near the warmth of the fireplace. The rushes on the floor, dried grass spread thick across the stone, would rustle softly as people settled down. Outside the thick walls, the wind might blow and rain might fall on the courtyard, and the horses in the stable might shift and stamp, and the watchman would walk his slow circuit along the top of the wall, looking out at the dark countryside below. And the castle just stood there, solid and still. As it had stood for years already, as it would stand for years to come, over a very long time, over hundreds of years. Castle building changed and improved. Early castles were made of wood, actually, before the stone ones. The very first ones, built quickly, were timber towers on big earthen mounds. They didn't last as long as stone, of course. Wood rots and burns. But they could be built in just a few weeks, which was useful when you needed a castle in a hurry. And then, gradually, the timber was replaced with stone. First the towers, then the walls, then everything. And the castles got bigger and more complicated. More towers, better gatehouses, deeper moats, higher walls, and the people who built them got cleverer and cleverer at the craft of it, learning from each new castle what worked and what could be done better next time, passing that knowledge on to the next generation of apprentices who would go on to build their own castles and pass the knowledge on again. Right down through the centuries, like a long, slow chain of learning. And here we are, 1,000 years later, and some of those castles are still standing. There's a castle in Wales called Conwy, built in the 1200s, that still has all its towers and most of its walls. There are castles in France and Germany and Scotland and Spain and Italy, old and mossy and quiet now, with their great halls open to the sky and their wells long since gone dry. Tourists walk around them on sunny afternoons, looking up at the walls and trying to imagine what it must have been like. Children run across the courtyards that were once full of noise and animals and cooking smells. A cat sits in a patch of sunlight in the undercroft where once the barrels of salted fish were stored. And in the walls, if you look very closely, if you run your hand along the old stone, you might feel a mark. A little carved shape, a chisel line, the shadow of a tool. The mason's mark, still there after all this time, 1,000 years old, and still there. So that's how a castle was built. Slowly and patiently, and by hundreds and hundreds of people. Stonemasons and carpenters and blacksmiths and diggers and carters and tile makers and well diggers and plumbers and painters, all working together day after day, year after year, in the wind and the mud and the cold. Building something that would last. They couldn't have known, those workers, that their walls would still be standing 1,000 years later, long after anyone had forgotten their names. But the walls are still there. And the little hidden mason's marks are still there. And the putlog holes in the stone, where the scaffold poles went in, those are still there too. All those quiet marks of human hands. It's a nice thing to think about, isn't it? That all around the world tonight, there are old stone walls that have been standing since before anyone now alive was born, since before their grandparents were born, since before their grandparents' grandparents. Further back and further back, all the way to the people who cut those first stones out of the hillside with hammer and chisel and loaded them onto a cart and drove them slowly down a muddy road. All those hands. all that patience. Just building quietly, one stone at a time. And now it's very quiet, and the old castles are resting in the dark out there somewhere, their walls soft and gray and still, their towers standing up against the night sky, just as they have done for 1,000 years. And you can rest now too. Close your eyes, and maybe somewhere in that soft, sleepy darkness you can see it. The pale stone, the tall towers, the little carved mark hidden in the wall, and the mason walking slowly home through the evening, tired and quiet, with strong hands and heavy boots. Going to sleep, just like you. Good night.